Doctor Who, 8-bit and beyond. Over the years, there have been a surprising number of Doctor Who games hitting home computer systems. Today I'm going to take a look at 4 of the early ones, the ones that were published for the 8-bit machines. And let's be honest, despite advances in technology, the 8-bit machines were the very best. Graphically challenged? Yes. Sounds made up of blips? Yes. Long loading times from cassettes? Absolutely. But because of this, these games gave us something that modern gamers will never have the joy of experiencing: the importance of your imagination working with the game. To an outsider, maybe an aunt or uncle looking over your shoulder at your CRT, there is a clash of different coloured squares. To us, the players of the 1980s, this was very clearly the Doctor scrambling to escape from the mines and return to the TARDIS, before yet another regeneration was forced. This truly was the golden age of home computer systems. 8-bit refers to the very early home machines, in the UK very much the Sinclair Spectrum and Amstrad CPC, and in the US the Commodore 64 dominated this market. 8-bit, very broadly speaking, refers to the limits of the central processing unit within these systems. 8-bit means they're able to process 8 bits of information at a time, and could utilise operations only on numbers 0 to 255. As technology advanced, 16-bit systems were introduced. In home computer systems, this was primarily the Commodore Amiga or the Atari ST. They could process 16 bits of information at a time, and could perform operations on numbers from 0 to 4,294,967,295. So some serious progression between those machines. But today we're going to look at the 8-bit games, with a small flirt with one that appeared on both 8-bit and 16-bit systems, and is my personal favourite. This will give me a really good reason for firing up my emulators and classic consoles. So the first official adventure was called, well, Doctor Who: The First Adventure. This was released in 1983 by the newly formed BBC Software, and released exclusively on their BBC Micro system. If you were in a British school in the 80s, you'll likely recognise this machine. It's estimated that in 1983, 80% of British schools owned at least one BBC Micro computer. This original game featured the Peter Davison incarnation of the Doctor. Not that you'd be able to tell from the single pixel that represented him, but the amazing cassette artwork made it clear, just to be sure. The game was made up of 4 mini-games, cloned from already existing games, but with just enough changes to avoid copyright claims.
Yes, they dare.
Pac-Man, Frogger, Space Invaders, and Battleship. The game was released on the 8th of April 1983, sandwiched between the King's Demons in March and the 5 Doctors in November. I can't find the release price, but based on the system and the year, the game is likely to have set you back about £10, just over £34 in 2025 money. While it does look really basic, this really was pushing the limits for 1983. Over the next few years, graphics and gameplay improved on the 8-bit systems. Not as a consequence of advances in the systems themselves, that would come later, but as a result of the programmers really understanding how best to utilise the machines and push them to their limits. They had to be innovative and creative, and out of this innovation and creation, the developers really pushed these 8-bit machines to their absolute limits. The game designers and programmers of the 80s were pioneers. In 1985 came the second official Doctor Who game, Doctor Who and the Warlord, again from BBC Software for their BBC Micro system. A ZX Spectrum version was planned but never saw development. This is surprising, as Spectrums were reported to be one of the easiest machines to code, and at the time they carried large sale numbers for games. Perhaps the BBC wanted another BBC Micro exclusive. This was a text-based adventure. You were given a narrative and were required to input your choices, which progressed you through the game. At the time, choose-your-own-adventure books were really popular. You made choices through the book, and this directed you to the page that progressed your adventure. The increase in availability of home computing in the 80s capitalised on this genre, with text-based adventures being well suited to the limitations of these 8-bit machines. The text contained within this game is beautiful, The writing is something that would not have looked out of place in the target novel range. I'm really surprised Terence Dicks didn't try to novelise it. Graham Williams, Doctor Who producer during the Tom Baker Gothic horror era, was involved in the design of the game. The game was later repackaged simply as The Warlord, with all references to Doctor Who being removed. 1985 also saw the release of Doctor Who in the Mines of Terror, initially exclusively to the BBC Micro, with 1986 seeing it released to the Amstrad CPC and Commodore 64. This game features the Colin Baker incarnation of the Doctor, and we can see the advances in programming from the original game only 2 years earlier by the presence of sideways scrolling. This is where the screen scrolled around the gameplay rather than the screen refreshed for a new area. Think Jet Set Willy. The plot of this game is odd. It's officially described as: the gameplay centres on the player's character of the Doctor, specifically his sixth incarnation, and his robotic programmable cat Splinks. The goal of the game is to halt the Master's production of Hetonite, retrieve stolen plans for the Time Lords, and return safely. A clue to this bizarre plot can be found within the game's origin. It was initially intended to be a sequel to Castle Quest, a hit game for the BBC Micro, but mid-production changed to include the Doctor Who character and licensing. I would suggest that this plot was carried over from the original intended Castle Quest 2 game, with some changes shoehorned in to accommodate the Doctor Who licensing. The 1984 Activision Ghostbusters game was also originally another game, but changed to include the Ghostbusters franchise at the 11th hour to capitalise on the then popularity of the movie. The game includes some very familiar looking robots as enemies, but these were definitely not Daleks, no siree, as Terry Nation did not sanction their use. Maybe they were Ralix from the planet Maro. The BBC Micro game required more than the 32 kilobytes of RAM the system had to offer, so it shipped with a RAM expansion slot to allow the game to run. This was unlikely to have been an issue for the Commodore 64 and Amstrad CPC versions, which both carried 64 kilobytes of RAM as a minimum. The final game of the 8-bit era was Dalek Attack. Initially released in 1992 on 16-bit machines, it went on to be released a year later in 1993 on the Spectrum console and Commodore 64. 1993 was very late for 8-bit games, with most publishers moving over to 16-bit machines for their output. This game really pushed the limits for these 8-bit machines. The Spectrum version only allowed for players of 7th Doctor, with the Commodore version allowing players the 4th, 5th and 7th Doctor. In the game, the Doctor battled the Daleks in London, Paris, New York, Tokyo and Skaro. K9 and Davros made an appearance, as does Ace, and in the Commodore 64 version, a random unit soldier. The gameplay and broad plot demonstrates how far along programmers were able to push these systems, especially if compared to the original just 10 years earlier. While the Commodore 64 managed to emulate the 16-bit version of the game to an extent, the Spectrum version was much more limited. On other systems, the Doctor could use a hoverboard. On the Spectrum, he was very much grounded. The Spectrum version was only able to offer 3 enemies: Ogrons, Robomen, and of course Daleks. The game was only released on the Spectrum after pressure from your Sinclair readers and, reportedly, gaming Doctor Who fans. Alternative software caved, and the rest is history. As already mentioned, 1993 was very late for 8-bit machines, and this was to be the very last full-price licensed game to be released for the Spectrum. Of all the games discussed today, I only remember playing one at the time, and that was Dalek Attack on my beloved Amiga. So I couldn't resist firing it up again for one more play.